Well, welcome back and thank you for continuing along with us here. So building on this question about what Native Studies is forces us to come back again to the question of what is a Native American. So I mentioned this in the beginning that in many ways that's the fundamental question that we're trying to answer in a class like this. What even is a Native American? And if you think in your own head about what your perceptions of Native people are, you might find yourself conflicted. Is it the representations we've seen in movies all of our lives, in westerns and other kinds of movies where Native people are represented? We've all seen movies that have representation of Native Americans in them. Is it that? Is it a kind of idea of is it Sitting Bull or Geronimo or these kinds of historical figures, Pocahontas, these very famous historical figures that immediately come to mind, and we have an image in our head of what they look like and what their important role was in a moment in history. Is that what it means to be a Native American? I don't know. That's another kind of thing that's influencing our ideas. Is it a sort of set of stereotypes about what Native Americans are? Is it a kind of vague understanding in our head about alcoholism, about poverty on reservations, about reservations themselves? Is it something to have to do with that? Is it these perceptions that we have of Native people? Or is it something within the Native community itself? And so we're going to talk about the racial category that is being a Native American. When you fill out a census where it asks you for your race, one of the check boxes is often going to be Native American, sometimes Native American or Native Alaskan or Native Hawaiian or something like that, right? So there's a kind of racial tick box. It's a cultural category. It's an ethnic category. It's a language family or language category. It's all these categories at the same time, all overlapping with one another. It's a set of cultural knowledge and artistic expressions. And it can be all those same things at the same time. And that's why this becomes such a challenge to define. And so we'll talk about all those issues throughout the entire semester. It's going to be one of the overarching kind of themes of the class, is trying to not necessarily answer the question, what or who is a Native American, because that maybe isn't an appropriate question to really ask anybody in particular. But how do we even start to frame that question properly is maybe where we can try and get in the course of this class. And we'll talk a little bit about blood quantum, about bloodedness versus cultural categories, pan-Indianism and tribalism, all these different ways that Native people actually categorize themselves and how those conflict with the way that outsiders categorize Native Americans, and the way that those things kind of conflict with one another. Now, in order to tackle these questions, there's a couple of important terms or concepts that I need you to be familiar with. And so I'm going to introduce these now, right off the bat, and these will be fundamental, sort of our theoretical framing for the class, if you will. The first term is one I've mentioned already a couple of times, and that's colonialism. There's a lot of different ways that we can frame colonialism. It is a massive study, both in anthropology and other social sciences. It's incredibly complicated to try and define this term. It's a super influential phenomenon in human history, really. And it happens all over the world, something I'll talk about in a moment. But to define it by its simplest terms, it is the study of culture contact. So two cultures or more than two cultures come into contact with each other. What happens? Do they both change? Does one change? Does one dominate the other? Does one resist that domination? That process is called colonialism, and the study of that is called colonial studies. And so that's the frame we're going to use that a lot, because the study of Native American history is the study of colonialism, at least for the last 500 years, which is the part of Native history we're going to focus on in this class. We will talk about so-called prehistory. We will talk about archaeology a little bit in this class, but we're going to primarily really focus on the last 500 years, and really, especially the last 50 or 60 years of Native history. It's really where we're going to spend our time. So we are absolutely going to be working within a colonial framework and understanding the world through a colonial framework. Now, the study of colonialism is really important because it has happened all over the world. In a moment, I'll talk about the papal bulls of the 15th century and the spreading out of European powers in the early colonial era, and the way that affected Native people. And we'll see that colonialism has really touched every corner of the globe and affected all people on the planet, which is why it's so important to study it. We also have to understand the notion of authenticity. We'll talk a lot in this class about politics and the way that current and past politics have influenced Native people and given or robbed them of their power, of their enfranchisement, of their resources and their lands. The way that we can study that is through a lens of authenticity and inauthenticity. The way Native people are attacked, and I'll have a cartoon at the end of today that's really going to drive this home. The way that Native people are attacked when people are politically opposed to them is they have their authenticity questioned. People say they're not real Native Americans. This is something that has happened over and over and over again since the 16th century at least, and absolutely is still happening today in every single place. And so we're going to talk a lot about what does it mean to be authentic? What does it mean to be authentically Native American? What does it mean to be inauthentically Native American? Who gets to decide who's authentic and who is inauthentic? Because that person has a great amount of power. Is it us? Is it scholars? Is it me, a sort of Native studies professor who's not actually Native? Is it only Native people who get to make that determination? Is it the government who gets to make that determination? The people who get to make that call have incredible power over Native people's lives. And yeah, the last sort of overarching thematic term I want you all to be familiar with is something called intersectionality. Now, this is a central driving theoretical paradigm of social theory today in 2017. You will probably see this term again in other classes. You'll certainly see it in anthropology classes. You'll absolutely see it in sociology classes, in any kind of women's studies, gender studies, ethnic studies. It's an incredibly important notion, usually attributed to Audre Lorde, who is a African-American woman and scholar and social theorist, but it's really a broadly used theory. Now, the intersectionality is the notion. It's a way of studying identity. So it is a way of understanding someone's identity. Traditionally, when we studied identity, we studied an aspect of identity. We studied racial identity, sexual identity, or gender identity. And we studied those things alone. And we understood that there were other aspects of people's identity happening. We felt that we could isolate those things. We could talk about race. We could talk about what does it mean to be Native American racially, right? We're going to isolate that. Intersectionality argues that is not possible. What intersectionality argues is that your identity exists only at the confluence of all the different aspects of your identity. So your identity is a central node of all these other aspects. So this little flow chart here that I pulled off Google somewhere, I kind of like because it's got a bunch of them. Race, education, sexuality, ability, that is to say, like if you're handicapped or not, age, gender, ethnicity, culture, language, class. There's a bunch of stuff that's not on here. Socioeconomic status, religion are very, very interestingly missing here, right? There are dozens of these that you could potentially pull out. And all intersectionality says, the theory says, is that we cannot look at any of those by themselves. So if we want to talk about race, we want to ask this question, what does it mean to be a Native American? We believe that's a racial category primarily. I'm not saying it is, I'm saying that's a thought experiment. If we want to study it as a racial category, we cannot understand a Native person's experience in that racial category unless we also think about their class, their gender, their age, their sexuality, their level of education, whether they live in a rural place or an urban place. The list goes on and on. And so we will, that's the way we're going to approach this question of what does it mean to be a Native American in this class is through an intersectional way. The reason why intersectionality is so important and authenticity is so important is because of this. This is a comic that ran in the Hartford Courant in 1993. Not that long ago, our own local paper right here in Connecticut in the year 1993, about 25 years ago. I was alive. Many of you may have been alive during that year. I'm trying to think. I guess most of you probably were alive in 1993 or just close to your birth. This was not that long ago, right? Not that long ago this comic strip ran. The political context of that moment was that the Mashantucket Pequots and the Mohegans had just opened or were in the process of opening their casinos. They received federal recognition from the government. That gave them the right to open gaming operations in Connecticut. And so we saw the opening of Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun in southeastern Connecticut, and a huge amount of money and power flowed into those tribes and into the state and into the coffers of the State House, and so on and so forth. There are 3 other state-recognized tribes in the state of Connecticut: the Eastern Pequot, the Schaghticoke, and the Golden Hill Paugussets. Those tribes do not have federal recognition. They do not have the right to open a casino. We'll talk about federal recognition processes, why it is very difficult and many would say extremely unfair, the process of getting federal recognition. And it is an incredibly political process. It's very little to do with whether people are actually Native American or not. Nonetheless, authenticity is an important part of the process. Many people did not want to see a third casino open in Connecticut, either because they disagreed with casinos through a moral perspective, because they felt like gambling addiction was a real problem, because they thought it created crime, whatever, or because of more political or economic reasons. They thought a third casino would be bad for the economy of the other casinos or for the economy of the state. And so people brutally attacked those other 3 tribes and their authenticity in order to discredit them so that they could not get federal recognition and open a tribal casino in other parts of the state. So the Golden Hill Paugussets, who are located in the Stamford area, southwestern part of the state, would be the closest tribe here in some ways, in New Haven, wanted to open a casino, and the way that they were attacked is they were told that they were too black to be Native American. They were too African American to be Native American. The reality is that almost every Native American on the East Coast, and certainly those in Connecticut, are of mixed race. I think probably in Connecticut. I don't think there are any pure-blood Native Americans in Connecticut. It would be impossible. Tribes have been on reservations since, in many cases, the 1650s. They're all mixed race. And many of them, if not all, most of them, have African-American heritage. And that African-American heritage opens them up to comment on their race. So they have to deal with the challenges of being Native American and the challenges of being black at the same time, and people play those 2 things against each other. We'll come back to this notion again.